Hi, Hertz. I've really been looking forward to this. If it's okay with you, I feel like this is a small enough, intimate, and interesting enough group. I mostly just want us to talk. So my suggestion is that maybe give me about 15 minutes head start. Let me create a little bit of context, but then the runners will be available. Raise your hand. Cool points for the first person who asks a question. I'd rather that just turn into something interesting rather than me blah, blah, blahing to you about X for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. All right? Excellent. So I'm the captain of Moonshots at a place called X. X is the Moonshot Factory for Alphabet. So our job is to invent and launch breakthrough technologies that are designed to tackle some of the biggest problems in the world, and if we're doing our job correctly, create the foundations for large, enduring businesses. So that's our job. Thinking about it another way, our job is to make new characters for the alphabet. So Google Glass was mentioned, Waymo was mentioned, other things that have come from X that you might know about, Google Brain, which Dario was just talking about OpenAI. I'm sure the word transformer came up. That came from Google Brain, which came from X. Verily, the life science business for Alphabet came from X. Wing, the drones for package delivery, that came from X. Intrinsic, which is the moonshot for industrial robotics, that came from X. So I'm happy to talk about more of these kinds of things. There are others as well. And I will get into some specifics when I use examples. But that gives you a little bit of a context about what we're trying to do and some of the things that have come out of what we're doing. Here's the tricky bit. It's really easy to do radical innovation if you don't care about efficiency. You find very smart, very high energy people, you throw money at them, and you walk away. Something great will happen, but it's not efficient. It's easy to be efficient. If you're just arbitrarily uptight for long enough, you'll get efficiency. You just won't get any radical innovation that way. It's finding that place in the middle where you have sort of the 80-20 rule, where you can have rigor around a process that is inherently messy and uncontrollable, so that you can guide and shape it and get efficiency. Not efficiency like perfection. Think efficiency like the card counters of innovation, where if you can get from losing against the house to winning against the house, it might only be a few percentage points, but it makes all the difference to sort of be in the black. So that's what we think of as our job. Except it turns out that most of what's hard about life, I'm sorry to share this with you all, is not the technology. The technology is interesting. I'm a card-carrying super nerd, at least I used to be. I wish that that was where I spent most of my time, but it's not the hard part. The hard part is people. It's human nature. So let me describe to you a little bit of what we're asking people to do at X, and then why it's hard. And then I'm going to transition into how we try to take those things out into the world. So when you're asking people to do radical innovation, you want to start with a very wide funnel. You're only interested in things that are probably wrong. Problem number one. Scientists and engineers hate being wrong. So picking something that's almost certainly wrong makes them feel sick to their stomach on day one. Then, right after they pick something where they're almost certain to be wrong, you want to start filtering really hard on the basis of evidence if you were going to be like the card counters of innovation. So you want to have huge amounts of audacity to try things that are very unlikely to work, albeit that if they worked, it would be really great for the world. But then you want to have the humility to start filtering really hard on the basis of evidence and to say, nope, that one's not it. As soon as you commit to doing that, you have to commit to very long-term horizons. You're shooting over the horizon. You can't know what the right answer is. And so there's this weird tension where your goal, this North Star you're shooting for, whether it's self-driving cars or something else, you're not getting there for at least a decade. There being, it works, you're making even some money doing it. But you can't just like sit around building the right thing from the beginning. You don't know what the right thing to do is. So you have to break down the problem into little pieces, which feels like a capitulation of the North Star you just picked. Because you're like, we're going to do this amazing thing 10 plus years from now, I hope, over the horizon. We can't even see it. Now I'm going to be in a learning mode here doing what feels really incremental right now and figuring out how to have that almost double think for people. Most people at X, most people I can even imagine hiring, struggle with that. So a lot of how X is set up is to help people through these struggles around what it means to be working on things that are very unlikely to work, to do what we all aspire in academia to do, and all of you who are in academia know there's a little bit of it, but not as much as we would hope. Intellectual honesty, some, not great. But it's okay. In the industry, some, but not great. We would wish that it was about whose idea was best instead of wanting your idea to win. In academia, some, but not great. In industry, some, but not great. But if you were trying to design a context where, as a team of people, you could be trying lots of things, filtering on evidence, and having the output be really great for the world as efficiently as possible, these are the things that you would have to get the team to do. Things like not having it be about your idea, playing the long game, breaking things into small pieces and being obsessed with learning, not being obsessed with building or being right. So park that. That's some context on X. I'm happy to come back to that. All right, I'm going to give you the cool points. I'm going to give you some more context because I'm going to try to turn this a bit, but I want to encourage the question asking, so cool points.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask, like, as you're doing this process, like, you know, you'll have wild ideas and you want to encourage people to be vulnerable to have those wild ideas, and then those wild ideas are oftentimes going to get shot down by the other people. How do you make it safe for people to be in that vulnerable space, particularly if they, for other reasons, might be vulnerable on other axes? Like, how do you engineer that?
Yes. That is one of the hard parts, and to unpack that a little bit, we're asking people to operate at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as though they've already nailed not only like I've got a place to sleep and I'm never going to go hungry and neither will my children, but also the sort of self-security. I am a good person, you know, I'm not a failure as a human, so that you can start to really self-actualize. That's what's at the top of that pyramid. That's what we're working on, but lots of people, even super successful people like me and like yourselves, are still struggling with that middle piece in various ways. And so asking people to like pin audacity, which is essentially asking them to pin self-confidence, but also pin the needle on humility at the same time. Audacity and self-confidence are very similar, or it requires huge amounts of self-confidence. Humility and very low ego are very similar. But finding people who have off-the-charts self-confidence, but whose ego is in the ground, super hard. It's easy to find narcissists who are just like all self-confidence, but then their ego is also through the roof. It's pretty easy to find people whose ego is in the floor, but then usually their self-confidence is in the floor. So everyone is struggling on some front in this middle part. And so then asking them to do that, it's hard. Let me give you some examples of the sorts of things that we do. You sit with me, we're in a conference room, maybe we're even on stage at All Hands. You have an idea. Hey, what if we could harvest the power of avalanches? You know what? That's a frickin' cool idea. It's not gonna work, but it's creative. Like, brains that say that are gonna say some important things too. I like how outside the box that is. High five, I'm serious. Great, let's see how fast we can kill that idea. Okay, like, how often do avalanches happen? How much could you restore it in a particular place? Not very much. How would you like move the equipment around such that you could like somehow get all that energy from the avalanche? I think we could sort out pretty quickly that that's not going to work. And then we high five again. Great, it's dead. Move on to the next one. Because it's not about you were wrong so you lose. You should, if we're doing this right, get 2 pieces of credit. One, for being a creative, wide part of the funnel person, and then 2, being a dispassionate filterer on the basis of, in this case, evidence is really just thought experiments that satisfy us it's not going to work. If you can get the social norms rewired around that being a double bonus instead of somehow a double negative, where you not only lose on the second point, but it actually invalidates the first part, things start to change. So we give bonuses for people when they kill their projects, especially if they've been working on them for a while. We stand them up at all hands and congratulate them for doing that. Because that moment of intellectual honesty, of dispassion, is actually the rate-limiting step of innovation. So if we only promoted people when they get a win, then are you really going to take chances that are 1 in 100 of getting a win, no matter how good the expected utility is of getting that win? No, you're not. But if we start with this sort of thought experiment, would you take the following deal? It's a lottery ticket. It's $1 to buy the ticket, 1 chance in 100 that it pays off, and it pays off at $1,000. Would you take that lottery ticket? This is a mathy group, so everyone's like, oh, it does. Like, expected utility of $10. Of course I'll take that ticket. But at work, you won't. No one will. Because if you have a 99% chance of getting a 0 on that lottery ticket, on this intellectual lottery ticket you're taking, you believe that is a bad deal for your career. You won't get promoted, you won't get a bonus, you won't be respected by your peers. That fundamentally is what X is trying to harvest. That is an arbitrage opportunity of global scale. There's an embarrassing amount of money to be made in that arbitrage and a crazy amount of goodness for the world to be harvested in that arbitrage. So how serious are you and me about making a team, I don't even know how to do it for sure, where we go after that arbitrage? That gives me chills to go after that. If it gives you chills too, okay, we still have to figure out how to make it not feel stupid to do that thing, but let's start putting stuff into the water, finding different ways of signaling to each other that we're really serious about that game. That's basically what the Project at X is. So I am happy to continue to go down that path, but give me at least 1 minute to describe to you one of the things which I think could be interesting to you, which is when we set off on any of these unlikely journeys, there's lots of interesting dimensions. They come in almost any industry. But along one dimension, I thought we could have an interesting conversation. So first, let's call it bucket 1. There are things where if we can make it work, we'll know that we have holy grail Nobel Prize stuff without really ever having left the lab. Time machine, room temperature superconductor. You probably don't need to go out in the world to verify you've done something super important, to the lead into gold machine, whatever that is, right? You can figure out in a room smaller than this if it's real. Bucket 2 are things where you have to get out in the world, but in a pretty tame way, in a controllable way. Examples that I think of in bucket 2, if you have robots, which we do, the Everyday Robot Project, which has now been merged in with the Google Robotics Project. There's been a bunch of press about it recently, which some of you may have seen. You need those robots to actually be wandering around with humans, but the safety is pretty good. They don't need to be in hundreds of buildings. They need to be in 1 or 2. They can even be in your buildings for a while. So that's real world, but it's pretty tame real world. The stakes aren't that high. Another one, we have a moonshot. The latest other bet is called Mineral, which is our moonshot for the agriculture space. I can tell you a little bit about that if you're interested. In that particular one, we're not going to make our own strawberry field. I guess we could, but it's at scale not very realistic. But the stakes are low again. If you get a robot into a strawberry field and it squishes some strawberries, meh, sorry about that. So there has to be some arrangement between you and the people who are growing and harvesting the strawberries. But again, the stakes are kind of medium. So let's put that in bucket 2. But then there's bucket 3. Bucket 3 is you have to be in the real world in an intense, complicated way where there's no lab equivalent and the stakes are pretty high. We've done this a lot, not because we want to, but because we want to solve the problem. So self-driving cars are a good example of this. You can go on a track till the cows come home, but you're not really going to learn about self-driving cars that way. Our drones for package delivery. I mean, you could like find some empty field and fly back and forth, but that's not the hard part. You like, really need to be trying to like hand something to somebody in the middle of a busy urban environment, or in fact have them be able to give something to a drone in the middle of a busy urban environment. You have to be able to cope with all the complexity of a real urban environment, but then the stakes all of a sudden are kind of high for doing that. Our project Loon, which was stratospheric balloons, these balloons are drifting all over the world, so that has a very different characteristic. The safety wasn't that bad, but there's like a serious international issue about crossing borders into country after country that we had to deal with. We have a moonshot going on right now for the electric grid. There is no, goodness knows the world needs a moonshot for the electric grid, for helping the electric grid move from where it is to where it needs to be in order for us to electrify the world, give the benefits of electricity to the world while helping instead of making climate change worse. And you can't make your own little play grid. It doesn't work that way, but this is the world's largest machine, the world's most complex machine, the world's most expensive machine. It's government regulated, as it should be, and you're like, hey, let me come in and mess with it with you. That's a big ask. So I'm going to go down through some of these and give you some examples, but what I'd love to do is get you asking questions and get us into dialogue about what it really means to go test your stuff in the real world, where what you want to learn can only be learned in intense interactions with the world where the safety, the regulations, or the people and what's happening to them, where the stakes are high. Yeah, go ahead. Cool points again for question number 2.
Hi, my name is Adele, and I'm a new fellow. As someone who just graduated from an engineering undergraduate program, I found that there was a lot of emphasis on how to solve problems and how to build things, but very little attention paid on how to choose a problem that was specific and interesting. And I found that when you would brainstorm with people, talking about engineering undergrads here, and you'd say, oh, what problem should we fix, like at a hackathon or something, you would get very generic answers, and usually based on something that reflected that person's upbringing or what you just read on the news as being important problems. So I'm curious, and as just a little more context, I feel that a lot of companies that are very successful, the problems that they solve arise out of a very specific niche from people who know a lot about that niche. So as an organization that doesn't necessarily seem to be embedded in a specific economic niche, how you go about selecting problems, and also how do you determine that a problem is appropriate to solve with technology?
Awesome questions. So I don't know if you've seen it, but the sort of blueprint of a moonshot that we use at X is 3 intersecting circles. So we try to live at the intersection of these 3 circles. The first one is a huge problem with the world. If you can't describe some huge problem with the world that you want to solve, then that is fundamentally an academic exercise. It's about the intellectual pursuit, not actually about the problem itself. So we require that there be a problem that you could describe. But if you work at X, I don't care what the problem is. It has to be a real problem. I want to feel good about solving that problem with you, but I don't have an agenda about which large, global scale human problem we're going to solve. If you can find a way to make poverty go away or make corruption go away, I'm good to go. But you can't just pick the problem. It's easy to come up with problems as you're describing. The second circle is a radical proposed solution. It's okay if we can't make it, but at least it has to have the characteristic, 1, it's a solution. That is, however unlikely it is that we could make it, if we made it, if it was working, if it was feasible, we could control the costs, it would solve that problem. So you have to be able to tell a little story about how this thing, this science fiction sounding product or service, would solve that problem if we could make it. And two, it has to be radical. Because if other people are going to do it, if this seems plausible, we're already too late, and it doesn't lead to our strengths. It means we're going to be in a spending contest with the rest of the world, a smartness contest with the rest of the world, a stay up later contest with the rest of the world. Those are not good contests to be in. I want to be in a creativity contest, a bravery contest with other people. That we maybe could have an edge in. But those other ones, those aren't good games to be playing. So that's why we require it to be a radical solution. So it leads into our strengths at X at least. And the third is breakthrough technology. You have to describe something. It's okay if you're wrong, but there has to be a hypothesis we can go test. And it can't be that we're going to have to work for many years and many millions of dollars before we get the first piece of evidence about whether we're on the wrong track or not. Because it's probable that we're on the wrong track. That's the sort of definition of this wide part of the funnel. So describing, here is a reason to have a glimmer of hope about that science fiction sounding product or service. And here's how, within months, we could learn at least a tiny bit about whether this is either more real than we hoped or less real than we thought. In the first case, we'll keep going. In the second case, we'll stop doing it. As soon as you have those three things, you have what we would call at X a moonshot story hypothesis. And then the answer is awesome, gorgeous, no matter what the problem is. Now, let's go prove as fast as possible, as cheap as possible, that you're wrong so we can throw it away and get on to the next one. Not because I want you to be wrong, it's just statistically, like 99% of the things that we try don't work out. So I need you in the mode of thinking this won't work out, so you don't start tying your sense of self-worth to it working. You tie your sense of self-worth to killing it for good, thoughtful, intellectually sound reasons. And you may not even discover that it can't be done. It's just that the lottery ticket is looking a lot less juicy than it did before. That's a good enough reason to stop doing it, because we can always pull more lottery tickets. The universe is not going to run out of problems, and it's not going to run out of creative ideas. We can come up with those all day long. So the cost of a false positive is very high. A false positive, we think something's going to be an amazing moonshot, and we discover in year 10 that we were wrong. Super expensive. The cost of a false negative, where it really was an amazing moonshot and we stopped it, is basically zero because we can always go get another one. Does that give you a sense of how to find that? And I realize that doesn't tell you which problems to focus on. I was actually just mentioning the following recently. People were asking a little bit about sort of headwinds and tailwinds to early projects. And I remember I was at Stanford my freshman year, and I didn't crew, but the crew team was posting posters in my freshman dorm. And it said, you have to be 6 feet tall to try out, or tough enough to make the difference. I feel like that's what it is with Moonshots at X. We'll take all comers, any idea you have, but we have to be realistic. We're looking at each of these things like a lottery ticket. And if you want to do something and we don't have the right electrochemistry lab, that is a mild headwind relative to if we do have the right electrochemistry lab, right, relative to whatever it is that you want to try out. All of the things that you propose, we should immediately start putting on the scales. What are the chances? How does this lean to our strengths? Where it doesn't lean into our strengths, is it building strengths that we're excited to otherwise build, even if this thing fails? So there's a sort of complex calculus for those things. I'm just going to start using examples till the next person raises their hand. Oh, all right. Yeah, this is more fun. This is more fun.
Hi, my name is Iris. I'm a recent graduate from Harvard. So I know earlier you were talking about like hiring people who have a balance of like self-confidence versus arrogance, right? Not too much arrogance, but for sure, like in any team that you hire, it's not like not everyone is at the same level, and but then it's important still to have like teamwork, contribution from everyone. And how do you like facilitate sort of that contribution from everyone when some people are like much more self-confident and like will try to like jump into like all the discussions, whereas other people have like just as good ideas, but like they're more shy about it and like maybe don't feel so comfortable contributing?
Everyone has a journey that they have to go on, and pretty central to what X is, we're trying to give people reinforcement on either side. So if someone is kind of running roughshod over the rest of any group, that's on the manager to say, the best we can be is not your brain. The best we can be is our brains, and you're, maybe not on purpose, making that harder. So Bob, like, you need to tone it down a little bit. If Susie in that same group is having a hard time speaking up, Susie, you deserve to be heard, but you also need to ask to be heard. That's a skill, just like Bob needs to learn the skill of shushing a little bit. You need to learn the skill of actually feeling good enough that you can try this out. And maybe you're worried about what people will say, but at least until you get your head bitten off a few times, maybe try it. You might be surprised at how much people are excited about your ideas. Also, a central thing that we do at X, we have 5 principles to try to help people run through these habits. So principle number 1 is taking smart risks. It's this issue of like thinking through what, for any hypothesis, what is the value of that lottery ticket? Number 2, perspective shifting. I believe that most of creativity, most of innovation comes from seeing things not as they are, but as they could be. It's changing how you understand a problem. It's not, the making is hard, but I don't think it's as hard as that sort of flash of insight. And it takes real work from teams to get to that new perspective. So that's number 2. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Number 3 is iteration. You have to commit when you're shooting over the horizon, when you're doing things that elude other people. It's not first principles work. You can't just go to a whiteboard and like do the math and come out eureka. It doesn't work that way, or someone would already have done it. So getting really smart people who want to believe they're right to commit that the way we're going to learn is through these very tight learning loops where we make something pretty shitty, just barely good enough so we can learn. We try it in the real world usually, figure out a tiny bit about like, oh, I get it a little better now, and then repeat. That's actually the core of what we do at X. So iteration's number 3. Dispassionately assess is number 4. If you can't be honest about the output from your experiment, what was the point of running the experiment in the first place? And most of academia is not good at this. Most of industry is not good at this, but it is as core as anything else. That moment of dispassion is something to be deeply proud about and to make sure as a team you're committed to before you start the experiment. And then the 5th one is, those first 4 things are so hard, the 5th principle that we have at X is reinforce the principles. That is, you have to be committed. If we're going to make this team together, you have to get that this is hard for you, it's hard for me, and so when you see someone doing the right thing, you have to say, hey, that was awesome, Susie. Thank you. That's how we should all be. Those kinds of moments where we give each other that positive reinforcement help get this sort of flywheel going. So back to the perspective shifting. Since perspective shifting is one of the 5 things we say, the more we can A, have people from different perspectives in any group, and B, actually have those perspectives heard, the stronger we will be at perspective shifting. And so we sort of have that as a bit of a mantra, which hopefully will get the Susie on that team to say, let me try it differently for a second. Let me just show you how it looks from my perspective. It's not about whether Susie's right or not. She might be wrong, but that helps kind of jog us loose from how we were thinking, and then someone can build on that. So reminding all of the teams at X that perspective shifting is central is part of how we encourage teams not to just get controlled by the loudest voice in the room. Does that help? Yeah.
Hi, Jen Roberts from ARPA-H. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you think of areas where there are misaligned incentives. So sometimes there might be, great problem, some ideas about a revolutionary new approach, but it's not necessarily like the main problem is that nobody's thought of it before, rather that many people might have this idea, but it's not happening because everybody's afraid to do it or the incentive's wrong or that type of thing. Is that something that you tend to take on or not?
Sure. So we're going to pretend for a second that you're at X. what I would say is, if you found a problem that people generally recognize as a huge problem, you've found a way of solving it that people seem to generally recognize as a way of solving it, but there's some kind of sticky wicket, some reason where, like, if the answer is, we're gonna blast through that wicket because we're Alphabet, no. Like, the whole world is looking to Alphabet to exactly not be like that. So that can't be the solution, even if you're right and this would be good for the world. So what I would say is, I'm excited, you've got my attention. How are we, in a really clever way, gonna get around that sticky wicket or help the world? That's where the creativity has to come in. So it's not a hard no, but I don't have a magic wand where I can just like make things be unstuck that other people can't. And often, if we have an idea, we find it delightful, but the first step or two is get everybody on board. That's not a thing. There has to be a way for us to start small, to start local, to prove out what we're doing, and then slowly get people on board. So I remember, it was a couple years ago, someone proposed some details around liquid democracy. So generally the idea is we've had a representative democracy on and off for a couple thousand years now. It's a cool idea that you like pick someone to represent you, then they can, for a group of us, be a full-time person whose job is to get smarter than us about the details and represent our interests to some sort of larger governing body. Awesome. Except historically, it's so cumbersome to elect people in that process that we elect them for all of our interests, and we elect them every couple of years. But now, with technology, there's no reason that we couldn't elect and de-elect people every couple of seconds. That we couldn't be sort of much more liquid in how much, and I might give you the ability to represent me on foreign policy matters, but you the ability to represent me on economic matters. There's a lot that technology allows. It's a fun, exciting conversation, but there is no way to start small and local. Like, you have to get the US government maybe literally to buy into that before you can start running the experiment. So that never went anywhere at X. That's maybe an example. I don't know if that's the kind of thing you were thinking of. But normally we just say, nope, tight learning loops. Tell me how this is going to be a tight learning loop, because this is back to the false positive, false negative thing. I love your idea, but I believe in you. You can come up with another gorgeous idea that's equally exciting and has the characteristic that we can be in tight learning loops. So if you don't have that idea, or if you don't have a way to do it on this one, let's go look for that on the next one. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Caitlin, and I'm a professor, just started a couple years ago at McGill University. And I love your whole approach to psychological safety, driving innovation. It's something I really tried to make foundational when I was building up my group as a young PI. And I'm really a huge fan of how you were describing getting people to ascribe to a set of values of how to interact in the workplace to drive innovation. And I'm curious, if there's anything that's done to address the fact that people might have very different starting points due to different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, whether anything is explicitly done, aside from the very nice reinforcement you were talking about to address that and to bring in people with different perspectives.
Yeah, I've struggled with this. I've struggled with almost all of these things, so these are awesome questions because they're like right under the chinks in my armor here. But that's what makes this interesting, so I like these kind of questions. Let me paint a bleak picture, which I don't particularly believe, but there's at least some legitimacy to this concern, which is if you are a person who has huge amounts of money in the bank, if you are, a straight, white male, if you have sort of like, maximum privilege, then you have like this really nice safety net. So failing a lot doesn't seem so scary. If you come from a background, if you don't have a lot of money in the bank, if you have a lot of social censure or prospective social censure because of aspects of who you are, whatever that is, coming at you, then maybe it feels a lot less safe to do that. And so that feels kind of unfair and accidentally exclusionary of us if we're leaning towards, let's say, failing quickly in the ways that I'm describing. There's at least some legitimacy to that concern. I'm not rejecting it out of hand. I would argue the opposite is also true. I think that the people with the most privilege have learned the least about how to be scrappy. And so everything I just told you about is a, like, just get in there and do it, like, up to your arms. And there's a creativity and a hard drivingness, an urgency to what we're trying to do that sometimes the people with the most privilege are actually the worst at doing. I don't know that people who have more privilege have cornered the market on creativity in any way. So while it might be socially a little easier for them to say something crazy or crazy sounding, I don't know that it gives them any special ability to see the idea in the first place. And coming from different backgrounds, if the world is somewhat oversaturated in the ideas of the people with privilege, then in a sense, the people who come from underrepresented backgrounds actually have something of advantage because they have ideas that have been underrepresented in idea space so far. So that's an example where, like, I can see the tension. Here's one of the things I do believe strongly, which is that some people have been underinvested in by the time they get to X. No question. The amount that the world has believed in and invested in some people is just an order of magnitude higher for some people than for others. We should be hiring because, remember, this is back to playing the long game, we should be hiring for people's true long-term potential, not for what can you do for me in your first week on the job. If we're looking at their true potential, then what their resume is, exactly which battle scars they've already picked up, how much they've already been invested in by the rest of the world, that shouldn't be how we decide things. And then once we get them in, if we have people who've been underinvested in, it is smart business, as well as the right thing to do as a human, as you know, for the world, to invest in them disproportionately to see where their ceiling actually is. And we do that at X. So those are two examples. Happy to take more on that, but maybe that gives you some sense of how we try to look at it. Yeah.
So how do you turn these very high-level ideas about innovation into concrete principles of how to build teams or how communication should occur at the company? And then also, how do you refine these sort of lower-level abstractions over time? Is there empirical study of the process of innovation that you do, and how does that manifest?
Yeah, so it is sort of turtles all the way down, unfortunately. I can give you like a layer 2 down example of the turtles. But to some extent, once you can really get the joke, once you can feel the resonant frequency that I'm talking about, then a certain amount of critical thinking will help you derive a lot of what I would have suggested. It's getting to that mode of like, oh, I see that there's a dynamic we're trying to get to, which is pretty different than dynamic that the rest of the world is in as it sort of explores idea space. And we're not there. We have this joke at X, we're like the worst Moonshot Factory in the world except for all the other ones, which is our way of being somewhat proud of what we've done and also very realistic about how far we have to go. So I will give you a few examples of the sorts of things that we do. We were just talking about hiring people, and so I give people, it doesn't have to be this specific, but this is the example I give to people. Oh, you're about to hire Susie for your team. She's a monster Python coder, and that's what you need. Well, hold on, time out though. Are we playing the long game? Yes. So here's my suggestion. Rate Susie, or rate everyone who you're interviewing, on how great she'll be at the first job she has in your project. Call that A. Rate her on how good you think she'll be at the second job she has at your project, which you don't even know what that is. Call that B. And then I want you to rate her on how great you think she'll be at her third job at X, which isn't even on your project. Call that C. I want you to multiply this by 5, this by 3, this by 0. And people get like, actually, that's stupid. Like, I need someone to do the work. I'm like, yeah, but this is what playing the long game looks like. So that's a really concrete example, and people are like, I hear you, but I got to get the work done. And I say, I understand, but whoever you hire will do some of the work, but I am betting that you're wrong about what the work you need to do is. That's actually most of what we do here at X, is figure out that we weren't even rowing in the right direction, and we should have been looking at the sextant a little bit more and rowing a little bit less hard. So you're like so busy rowing, and you're like, we got to get someone else on the oars. If you're going the wrong direction, who cares? But that's just so hard for people to get their heads around, and that is a very concrete piece of math I give people, which they mostly don't live by, but they don't have an awesome reason why I'm wrong. So I'm like, look, the people on your team, Jill, who's on your team, she's been here 5 years. You hired her from that other project at X. She is Susie 5 years ago, But you're just not thinking that way because you're thinking short term. So we try to create this sort of intellectual architecture that helps people connect with these higher level principles. So I'm happy to give some more, but that's an example of one.
Hi, my name is Liam. I'm a new fellow starting at MIT, and I have a bit of a complicated question, so I hope it's okay that I'm asking. So I think we can agree that there is like a landscape of problems around the world now, and for context, I'd like to know, out of this array of problems, you're going to only pick a few, right? We're people, we can't do everything. How do you know if that few problems you're picking are the right one? How do you evaluate that? How do you know, how do you think you even have some sort of responsibility? What type of responsibility do you have to pick the right problems? And how much do you believe this is influenced by the people who are sitting around the table and doing the picking?
Totally fair question. So for better or for worse, it is heavily influenced, it is almost entirely influenced by who's sitting at X. X is a very bottoms-up, not top-down in that sense. And I don't mean that in an entirely good way, it sort of is what it is. But I actually heavily self-censor personally, because the temptation is the sort of like Elon Musk view of the world, where there's like one person at the top and they're super, super smart and they just tell everyone else what to do. And I just don't believe that any of us are much better than random. I mean, maybe once in a generation you get a Steve Jobs who is better than random, but almost exclusively, I don't believe that any of us are better than random at predicting the future. And so I'm trying to train the people at X that this is a group exercise to put things at the wide part of the funnel and to filter them. I'm here as a coach, but it is not about my ideas. And it shouldn't even be about the ideas of my direct reports. I think because I modeled this behavior, they mostly self-censor too. So it's very bottoms up. And again, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on exactly what they come up with, on the sort of characteristics of who's at the sort of leaves of the tree at X. We don't pick problem areas and say, we're going to work on poverty. Because, I was actually just using this as an example a few days ago. Who knows if the sort of room temperature superconductor thing out of Korea is real or not? But let's say for argument's sake it is. That's going to open up a lot of new creative opportunities for people. People have been playing around with the idea of what you would do with room temperature superconductors for a long time, but we haven't gotten serious about them because we don't have one to play with. If there was one, that should be an awesome playground of new opportunities for X. But if we were really focused on poverty, it might well not be helpful in that area. If I'm asking you all, who now, for the next 20 minutes work at X, to come up with these things, these moonshot story hypotheses, you have to build them out of these new things that are happening in the world. So that is so hard to do that if I said, and you can only work on poverty, it would just be hard. So I'm not saying you can't work on poverty. If it's in your heart to find something in the poverty space, awesome. I think that that is a serious problem to work on. But that's on you, not on me, to find a problem or a piece of that to work on and a way to work on that that will actually move the needle, that has a chance so we can take a run at that.
Hi, Astro. I'm Joe. I am a neurotechnologist at MIT. So you mentioned a lot that you're driven by wanting to do good in the world, right? And I think that implies some kind of moral or ethical judgment. And I think we have to be really careful about how we make those judgments. So I was curious what systems you have in place for evaluating whether a potential project is in fact going to make a net positive contribution, how you make those ethical judgments. I think there are a lot of examples where you might naively think, say, like a project that might improve economic productivity in some sector might have a net positive ethical impact on the world, but in a vacuum it may result in simply more wealth inequality. So I'm curious what systems or procedures you have in place for evaluating those moral concerns.
For better or worse, I'm skeptical about having a kind of small ethics pod over on the side, and we sort of like pass everything through there, like putting it through our pancreas or something. I just don't think that's how to do it. If we all work at X, then if we're going to be serious about this or like motivated by doing good things in the world, then we have to be motivated by it. We have to become expert, at least as expert, at the ramifications, including the unexpected, the unintended consequences of what we're doing, and fixing those as we are at like making money or making the thing work in the first place. So A, that has to be all of our jobs. Two, while we're serious about profit in the long run, that description I gave you of huge problem with the world, radical proposed solution, breakthrough technology, it's not an accident that money isn't part of that framing, because I don't want us to start on a journey because of the money. I want us to start and have the initial framing be about solving the problem. I think that gives us some kind of head start on this issue. And then, this is back to the topic of getting out in the real world. One of the mantras at X is get out into the real world. I don't believe you can actually understand on a whiteboard by yourself what impact this is going to have on the communities that you're a part of by just like thinking with our big brains in some conference room in Mountain View. That's just not how the world works. We have to actually, in a safe, sandboxed way, get what we're doing out into the world, start to have those experiences, find out what the unintended consequences are, and then be constantly redoing the calculus around them. So I don't mind if on the way to helping 1 billion people, there are early price-insensitive customers. That kind of thing doesn't bother me, as long as we can articulate what is that path? How is this ultimately going to help people? And I also think we can't solve all problems. So one of the things that we have is a wireless optical communications project at X. It's a laser. It's a box about this big. Plug the internet into it if you have a fiber optic cable, shoots a terrestrial-based laser up to 20 kilometers, received by another box. We're getting 20 gigabits per second with 99% uptime over 20 kilometers. And it's cheap enough now that this is starting to get rolled out pretty quickly, mostly in the emerging markets. It's really exciting. So that is something we're very excited about because it's a good business, but I think the fact that economic development is so good for those communities when they're brought into the digital world, and there's a lot of evidence of that, that makes us feel really good. Is it possible that there are bad parts of the internet that we are bringing to them also? Yes. I can't be responsible for the whole internet, so I acknowledge that there may be downsides. I think it's still a net positive. Is it possible that the inequality of the village that just got 20 gigabits per second will go up, even though the tide is raising all the boats? Some of the boats will rise faster than others. Yes, it's possible. Let's call that V2 to go solve that. I still think we could look at that example and say, yep, this is actually helping. Yes?
Is on now? Okay, good. So basically, I think a couple questions had raised this before about sometimes you don't find the interesting problems unless you're kind of in the thick of it as an expert or domain expert. And so some of the notions of like, okay, we're almost like not a venture, like a Y Combinator or whatever for like these big moonshot ideas. It scares me as someone who is like, say, like highly trained in like theoretical physics, whatever, when you see kind of uninformed money like poured into like quantum computing or something like that. And I know like the main innovations would probably be coming from the experts in academia collectively, maybe not like we're all competing for like the next like technology that we can publish about, rather than from some company that just decides, yes, this is the thing I want to invest in, and we have people who can do whatever and they're transferable and they're going to tackle this moonshot when it fails. So I don't know to what extent you guys like interface at all with like trying to maybe empower the academics or the people who are the domain experts to have the attitude that you have about like seeing what can we collectively try to solve now and be more like cohesive about it, rather than just be like, oh, it has to be done in-house and then we throw things out.
We definitely work with academics. Occasionally we fund things in universities. More often we bring academics into X in the early stages. Our experience is, hey, you want to leave your tenured position or your postdoc position and come to X to see how fast we can kill this thing, and then maybe your job just evaporates. That's like a bit of a tough ask. So what we do usually in the early days, we say, we're looking at this thing. We're very open to the fact that we're wrong. Why don't you come in as a consultant and help us kill it? If we fail to kill it, if it's actually like looks like it has legs, then maybe you'd be excited to join the team. So that's kind of the dynamic that we often get in. I think this is a race condition between the blindness of expertise and the stupidity of naivete, because they're
But
both.
that's grad students, though, right?
Yes, exactly, exactly. If the experts have been blinded to the assumptions they can't even see anymore because they're so inculcated with those assumptions that need to be broken in order to make radical progress, the people who don't understand the field, good news, they have no respect for those assumptions, so they might break some of them, but they don't really understand how that world works, so they may come up with all kinds of theories that are just nonsense because they don't understand the basics of the field. And so that is why, I mean, we try about 1,000 things per decade, and about 1% of them like really work out. And it's partly for this reason, because we have generalists, they're pretty smart generalists, we have physicists at X. And so banging on these ideas in the very early days, we need to be almost problematically open-minded. But then right after we start, we need to be pretty savage about like applying the like, okay, here's what the experts say. How could that be wrong? Like actually wrong, not just like, nah, we believe.
Sure, but don't you think that the percentage would like success rate would be higher if instead of the experts being the consultants, the people like you were the consultants?
Sure. I mean, I guess if you're offering us a job, we're happy to come try to help you out. And I mean, actually, in a tiny way, this is what I'm trying to do right now, is come help. But yes, look, if a university came and said, here's something we're working on, how could you help us with it? That's a little complicated because we aren't a consultancy. But if we thought we could really move the needle in some way with a relatively small amount of time, we would do it. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm Sasha, a chemist from Caltech. Thanks for having a conversation with us today. I was wondering, X is a relatively young organization as far as organizations go, but thinking maybe like 100 years out, if X is still around, you're going to have like presumably X-lifers and various like people who have been generalists for a while now. I was wondering if there's any long-term vision to promote kind of dynamics within the organization, to if there's some need to ensure turnover intellectually, like from project to project even, or at the organizational level. Like how do you keep it from becoming like another university, right?
Yeah, it's very real. We're 13 years old, so I would say we're entering our teenagehood in several metaphoric senses as an organization. We've figured it out enough we can kind of get by, and we're still learning pretty quickly and changing pretty quickly. At the widest part of the funnel, we have like maybe 20 people who really work at that very wide part of the funnel. We're just sort of constantly churning through ideas. If we had the same 20 people there for more than 2 years, we would definitely dry up. That's not going to work. You need a flow of new people. So we try to have those people, when they hit on something, which has gone from a 1 in 100 chance to a 1 in 10 chance, to move with that thing, which they often will do because they're excited about the idea, down the funnel. And that doesn't mean they couldn't even go back, but we do try to have that dynamic happen. We encourage people to move from one project to another, so that sort of Jill Susie thing I was talking about earlier, that happens all the time at X, and we encourage it for this exact reason. There's a cross-pollination of interesting ideas, techniques, styles, ways of learning, ways of working with the rest of Alphabet and the rest of the world that just happens better if people are moving around faster. There's actually, even once something leaves X and it becomes something like Waymo, the self-driving cars, or Verily, the life science business, Intrinsic, the industrial robotics moonshot, it's its own company. It's largely owned by Alphabet, but they're now paid in the stock of this other thing. And so they're off to the races. But sometimes people say, you know what, I want to move back to X. And they're welcomed back most of the time, assuming that they had a good career there at X. And often, having been out in the semi-real world, sort of trying to drive things sort of to product market fit and like really becoming a business, they've been sensitized to some new things. And when they come back, even though they're the same person, they have some very different ideas. So we look for those kind of cycles. We use a lot of consultants, and we cycle those people through in that way too, where if they don't stick, fine, then they kind of bounce off us harmlessly. And if they're really great, they're enjoying being with us, we're getting a lot out of them, then we sort of suck them in. Do we have a last question before I end? All right, one more. All right.
Hi, Astro. I promise this is a fun one.
Excellent.
Alphabet's CEO and CFO are increasingly shot up by shotguns from Wall Street, right? So I'm curious about the up management you have to do and your challenges and learnings in getting like the long time scale support and budget needed to keep X going.
Interesting that he thinks that's a fun one to end on. I'm going to answer the question, but you have a very interesting job if that's fun to you. Now look, the deal with Alphabet that X has is we're wrong most of the time, and that doesn't look great in the short term. But we're really serious about trying to drive this efficiency. And in the end, Alphabet has to decide if the things that are coming out, sometimes that go back to Google, like Google Brain, more recently Cody, I don't know if any of you use it. This is the sort of part of the Bard system that helps you write software. That came from X, so that was a more recent thing. So we're helping Google in lots of ways, but we also create these other bets. Sometimes we spin things out into standalone businesses, but we keep some equity in them, so that ends up on the balance sheet. So I have to show that basket of things to Alphabet, and over the very long term, they have to decide if the value of the things that we're producing is worth more than the money they give us and the time value of money. And that's for them to decide, but I guess so far they still feel like it's worth it. And I would argue that not only are we, I think Alphabet is supportive of us, not just because we're doing a pretty good job. I think it's also because, as I've described to you today, being a defender of the long term, which every company needs if they really want to thrive in the long term, while being obsessed with getting efficiency into the process, driving rigor in ways that don't kill the magic, the creativity. If you ran Alphabet, much as you would get pressure about the short term from Wall Street, isn't that what you would want if you thought that the output was worth it relative to the input? So I hope that that's why Alphabet continues to fund us, but they do, so I guess so far they're satisfied. Hertz Fellows, I really appreciate your time. That was super fun.